So number one on the list is just making sure that you have the right size. So it's very easy to accept the default sizes for any composition. If you leave it at 1920 by 1080, your composition is going to be huge, and it's basically going to be 4 times slower to work with than the size that we're currently at. About. Yes, sir. Yep. And then, like I mentioned too, using OneNote, if any of these things, like we're constantly hitting on these same things, if you take screenshots and save them in there, then you know each time that's what I need to be doing. So 1280, 720, 24 frames per second. And then the duration is going to vary per assignment, but these sizes here will be the same throughout the entire semester. Okay. We want to also make sure we're starting to name our stuff. I wasn't too strict on it the first assignment because we were kind of new. The second assignment I was. Going forward, I'm going to be even more, okay? So I don't really care what things are named as long as it's obvious what they're called, okay? And don't spend a million years thinking about what you want to call something. Just call it exactly what it is. Showing examples. That's what my comp is, okay? I would make folders. I would have things inside composition folders. That's the wrong name. There we go. And then making a layer. Okay. And then I'm going to set some keyframes. Now at this point, we were 4 weeks in the class. We're not going to be covering the basics of these things, right? So going through, if you ask how to set keyframes, I'm going to say you're going to have to figure it out because 4 weeks in the class, we should know how to set keyframes. What are keyframes? That's even worse. All right. All right. So there's something coming in, something going out. We ease. We go to the speed graph. We make sure we're in the speed graph. And then we can adjust what those are looking like. Most of your items will have speed graph on them. Most of your items will have, pretty much every one of your items should have easy ease, okay? There's only a few instances where you wouldn't have that. But if I look through your keyframes and I see everything is the default keyframe, obviously you didn't apply any easing to it or any speed graph stuff. So make sure you apply those as well. Also, motion blur. Does this one have motion blur on it? No. We can tell because it's a crisp line. Click the button and now it has motion blur. Okay. So make sure as we're comping and then making pre-comps and making pre-comps and putting new comps inside of comps and all that, that as we're viewing our stuff, we're seeing those kinds of things. Okay, we're seeing, does it have motion blur? How do I turn it on? And so on. Okay. I believe those were the basic things that were kind of messy. Most people had pretty good organization, but make sure you do have some organization to how you're giving me files. I have a movies folder. I have my After Effects folder. I have my movies folder. I have my planning folder. I have my sound folder. I have my After Effects file. Okay. Keep those things organized inside and outside of After Effects. In this class, we're going to be working on individual projects, so it's not a huge deal if your files are all over the place while you work, but when you give stuff to me, I want it organized. In the industry, everything has to be organized from the start of it to the end of it. As you're working on a project, you might be doing the After Effects part, and somebody over there is doing the illustration part, and they're putting stuff into the folders that you will then grab. Or you're doing the art part, and they're doing the animation part, and you have to put stuff into the right folders, and if it's not, nobody can figure out their stuff, okay? Especially if we have clients that want these files at the end of it for some reason, we have to then collect everything and then be able to provide it to them, okay? So those were the bullet points of things that were After Effects wrong, okay? Other stuff that we need to strengthen in some areas is just the design aspects of it. So, skills. So on the Make at Macomb, there is, I didn't put it up there yet. I thought I did. Design principles. So principles of design, those same things that we talked about in design 1 class, the same things you talked about in InDesign class, and if you've taken any further design classes, if you've taken Illustrator, Photoshop, at some point they mentioned at least some of these principles or all of these principles. So make sure that you're using appropriate design things. You're looking at your animation not as a animation, but you're looking at it as a design that is animated. Okay. So we always want to look at that first. We want to look at what does the design of it look like. Does it look like a finished piece? Does it look complete? Even before we've animated it, does it look exciting? And then when we animate it, that just adds to the fun of the entire thing. Okay. Any one of these things that you're seeing like this, if I had that as a bunch of artwork, I could animate it 15 different ways and it would still turn out cool because that image is pretty cool. Okay. Same thing here, same thing there. If I come up with a piece of garbage design, I can do 5,000 animations for it and they'll all pretty much look like trash. Okay. So just consider that while you're working on your stuff. All right. So now getting into our page transitions. We're going to look at these here. Okay. Is this a page transition? Is it a good one? I'll give you a hint. This one sucks as a page transition. It's way too busy. Okay. It does. It hurts your eyes. Just wait. Okay. This is definitely a page transition. It covers the screen. It starts off blank, covers the screen, and then goes blank again. But it's just so distracting. There would have to be a specific reason I would use something like this. And that reason might be that I have a starfish, let's say, spinning into my frame, and then he spins up and then changes to another scene. That would be the only time I would probably ever use something this ridiculous. So even though it does work as one, it definitely sucks as one. Another thing to kind of pay attention to here is this. So as we put motion blur on things, this is it obviously without motion blur, there's a thing called samples. And as it blurs, the faster it blurs, the more samples that it's going to need. So most of your stuff won't need this, but I just want to show it just in case. Under your composition settings, there's 3 tabs up here. The first tab is the one we've always played with, the size, the rate, and all that. The advanced tab has the kind of motion blur, like how much motion blur is there. And then here's the samples. So if I take this up to, let's say, 64, you'll see that that smooths out a lot more. Now, we wouldn't want to take everything up to 64 because then it would slow down our station incredibly. It's basically taking it 4 times-ish as much time for the other one. Oh, it is 4 times. Okay, so just be aware of that. And if I play this back now, you can see how much slower it's even going because I have 64 samples. There you go. Now it's playing back. Still looks horrible. All right, how about this one? Yeah, like the optical illusions. Yeah. So it looks like it's covering the screen, but it's actually not covering the screen. A trick to seeing if it does cover the screen is this button here. This is your transparency grid. And what this will do is it'll show you what's actually transparent. When we're at the beginning here, it's hard to tell. Is this a black solid or is this actually the background that's showing? So I'm going to click on the transparency grid, and what do you think? Yeah, it's just the background, so it's transparent, okay? So what that means is if I were to put this on top of another piece of footage, that this would be transparent, okay? Which is good because I might have a piece of footage here, a piece of footage there, and I want to have this transition come on, fill the screen, and then go off and go to another piece. Now, as I play this, I'm going to hit play and watch. We see very little difference, okay? Because even though it looks like it's filling the screen, it's not. It actually is still transparent. And I can kind of prove that just by making a layer underneath. And I'll make it just this bright red. Now what should happen is when this thing plays, it should cover up the red all the way. And it doesn't. You can still see bits of red poking through. So that means that our video would actually be still there. And if we did a cut while the transition was up, we would see, you know, that transition go away. I'll just leave this here as a... And our final example here of bad stuff. Right. Yes. So the colors are horrible. The animation is horrible. Does it work as a transition? Yes. Right. Right. There's actually I made sure there was at least one frame where the entire thing was covering. But it's horrible, okay? So even though, and this is where in these kinds of classes, this is where the box could get checked. Yes, I do have a transition. Everything else is missing. The design is missing. The animation part of it is missing. Oh, so difficult. All right, let's ignore those. Just wash your brains out, and then we'll look at some other stuff. So here's a fun one. Okay. So now this one is a lot more appealing. The colors are nice, they're subtle. We go from nothing to fill the screen to something. You'll even notice I add these little lines in there to help kind of show the grid. Okay, this is our palette cleanser. But now let's look at how that gets created. So I'm going to jump over to my single solid. And what I did is I made a single composition that just does this. Okay, it just scales up and then flies off. To show it what one of these does, I'll just turn off all of them but one. And that's what it does. Okay. Now I could have used position. I could have taken the whole box and moved it into position, kept it there for a few frames, and then moved it out. But I did something a little bit different. I used what's called a null. Okay. And I used scale. Now the null, let me make a brand new composition and do this from scratch so you can see it. I'm going to make a new solid. I'll pick a pleasant color. I'll even go with like a green. I want to scale it from this corner. So mentally remember the hotkeys and stuff. So I'm putting my pivot down here, and I'm going to go to scale. That's not us. 0. Set my keyframe. Go up to, let's say, 8. Put it at 100. And you're going to see the same thing, ease in, ease out, blah, blah, blah. That's the same stuff. All right, so that looks good coming out. Okay. Now, I know that I'm going to do a layered stack, so I can't just start right after this and then, shrink it. I have to go up a few frames so I have a little bit of overlap. Now, if I were to scale this again, is it going to scale from down here? Yeah, because that's where the pivot is. So I need to move the pivot to this corner. I can't just hit Y again and grab the pivot and move it, because now my animation is then going to scale from that corner only. Okay, so basically I need 2 pivots for this. I need one pivot that will scale from here and another pivot that will scale from that area. Okay, so that's where the null comes in. So under layer new null, I have this. And this is just a blank object. It's nothing at all, but it allows us to create an extra pivot point for having stuff move or scale or whatever. So I'm going to control click it to this corner. And then to connect these two so that they work together, I'm going to grab my medium solid, go to the parent area, and say null 2. Now what that's going to do is anytime I now move null 2, it'll then move the other one. Okay, so those two are now connected. So if I go to null 2, go to scale, set a keyframe here, scooch up a little bit, set this to 0, we'll see that this one here scales up. And then right here, the null is going to start scaling and scale the whole thing down. Okay, so let me go and ease that. Switch that over. Okay, now if I duplicate this, you'll see that the keyframes for this one are still there, and it still keeps it parented to null 2. If you don't see this parenting tab, it's easy to, to hide it on accident. You can always go to columns and bring that back. Whoops, unless you're hiding other stuff on accident too. There it is. And bring that back. So I can just duplicate this, offset each one of these, and then obviously change the color so we can actually see something happen. Let's go with, I'm going to go with the darker color here. Okay. Motion blur on. I still think I might have those settings. Sometimes yeah, it's still at 64. I'll put that back to 16. There we go. Okay, now this null is scaling all of them at the same time. In this kind of instance, I would be fine with that. If I wanted each one to scale separately, I could rewind this to the beginning, duplicate all of these, and then offset the frames, and then just pick which one I want to be connected to which one. So if this one's going first, I want this one to go away first. So I would say you're on this one, and then you're on that one, and then you're on that one. Okay, so now we have that. All right, so I'm going to call this one single solid example. Okay, now I need to get multiple ones of these. That's how I created that one with all the pieces in there. So I'm going to take this single solid example and I'm going to drag it into the new comp. So that will automatically make a composition that size, that ratio, proportion, sizing, everything, and put that thing in there. So there it is. Okay. Now I need to duplicate this and scale it down. So what size should this be if I want to fit 3 of these across and 3 of these up and down? If the scale right now is 100, what's a third of that? 33.33333. And it sounds like it doesn't matter, but it does. If I typed in 33 and it was just a hair off to the point that I would have a margin, but if I type in 33.33 repeating a few times, then it works perfect. I can't see this, so I'm going to make that bigger. And then I just slide this over. And you can use your arrows. And what I recommend is if you do that, you throw it into position, then come down here and fix these numbers. So this is going to be 213, I believe, or 24. Nope, 213. And 120. There we go. Okay. Then I'm going to hit Control D and then go to position and then just slide that over. And 640. And duplicate that again, go to position, and slide that over. And if you do it right with this kind of thing, you'll see how there's no seam right there. Oops, there's a seam right here though. See, I messed that one up. 212, 214. There we go. Make sure there's no seam on that side. There's a tiny seam. All right, so that one wants to be 213.5 apparently. Okay. All right, so then I can just take all 3 of these, and this is going to be the tricky part. Duplicate them. See how it duplicates every other one? It's kind of weird how it does it. And then I'm going to slide it down here so these are all together, and then I can just slide this down. And then duplicate that again, slide these layers down so they're all together, and then slide this down. There we go. And so now if I rewind and hit play, I get this. Okay, so that looks kind of cool already. Then I'm going to take every other one. I'm going to go to Scale. I'm going to click the icon off here for each one of these. I said off. Okay, I'm going to click on, I think, the X, make this negative 33.333. All right, so now, so every other one is basically flipped the other direction. Okay, now I could do that even further and just take, every one of these ones. And this might give me the same result. I guess we'll see. I'm just going to make one of these or both of these numbers negative 33.33. There you go. And you can see how I can change the direction of it too. Just by playing with how these things are positioned, you can do that. Now I could also, if I undid my scaling, I could also switch over to rotation and rotate these 180 degrees and get a different thing. Okay. If you want to play around with it, go to a frame where you can kind of see the animation happening, and then just rotate it and see this is what's happening. Maybe I want this one to be like that, and then that one here, I want this one to be negative scaled. And I'll take this one and make sure that one is negative scaled in the Y direction. And now I get that kind of look. Okay, so there's a lot of things you can do once you have that whole concept under your belt as to how that works. And then for the bars, that was just the same trim path I used before. I just drew some extra lines in here and synced it up inside this comp. So this would be my transition. So I would then rename this one solid multiple comp final. All right, so now let's say we didn't like those colors after we did all that work. So we could go back to our original single comp here and change this color. Okay, so I can go to any one of these three and just change their color. Control Shift Y, grab this, make it red. Not just that one though, it's ugly. That one, I think I'm gonna go with more of a whitish red. Yes. Yeah, how they're like that. The closer you get the colors to each other, the easier it is to blend between them. And sometimes you use the eyedropper and find that like this is the in between, and that sometimes will give you a happier color. It's still not there. I think I'm gonna go eyedrop maybe like. If I drop this, yes, brighten that up. All right, that's sufficient for now. I'll adjust that later. Okay, so I can obviously adjust the color in there. But let's say on this one, I wanted more than just one color. I don't want to have to redo that entire composition or readjust the placing of any of these. So what I can do is take that single solid example, duplicate it, and I'm going to start renaming these. So this one is going to be a single solid example red. And then this one will be single solid example blue. Duplicate that again, and I'll have one more that's going to be green. Okay, then I can just go into this. I can go into that one and change the colors. Now, if I get worried that I'm going to change the colors too much, and it might be like, these are more pastel-y, these are more vibrant, these are more vivid, whatever, I'm going to use something else. I'm going to go to layer, new adjustment layer. There we go. So I put an adjustment layer in here, and then I'm going to go to my color correction and do a hue and saturation. Then I can just slide this over to a blue. This is the blue one. And I can go back, now go to the green, and do the same thing. New adjustment layer, new hue and saturation, slide this over to green. Okay, so now when I go to my multi-comp, they're all still here just like this. But if I go to my project, and let me get rid of all the attributes, I'm going to replace some of these with these ones here. This will be a valuable thing as you make new artwork and you want to position it and keep the keyframes and everything you've done. I click on the item down here that I want to replace. I hold down Alt and I drag this on top of that. And what it'll do is it'll just, whatever attributes are in the composition, it just replaces it. Whatever was there, any keyframes, anything, just overwrites it. So I can go to, let's say, a couple of these. That one. Maybe I'll go to the corners here. And I'll grab the blue and drag that in. There we go. And I'll grab the other corners and also make them blue. Just so we have some kind of pattern here. So it's holding Alt, dragging it on top, And now we have different colors in there. Okay, now I also could have just gone into this one, let's say this is the red one, and I could have put a hue and saturation right on that red one. And that way I'm controlling it all live right inside this composition. So this is why we would have compositions inside compositions. We may have different things that we want to do and tweak and modify globally, which is what I did with the red, green, blue, or locally, which is what we were doing right inside here. Okay. So that's another example of a page transition, a little bit fancier, a little bit more complex, but still exciting. Let me reset that. I have to close some of these windows so I can get to some of my other compositions. That one. Here we go. Okay, so here's this one. Okay, now this is the same thing. It's built on the same concept of I have a transition and I want to fancy it up. Okay, so this is what the transition looks like normal, just like that. Yeah, and then that texture on top of it just adds a nice little pop. Okay, so this is built off of two things. I have a bands composition which does this. Okay, this is done by taking the scale. I put the pivot right here at the bottom, and I'm just scaling it up. You can watch them scale up. Okay, and then do you want to guess what this is right here? Drop shadow. Not on every one, but on every other one. So I have a drop shadow on this one, and that one only. Okay, because if I put on every one, they would kind of get like overlapped and look kind of cluttered and messy. So just those three are my top layers. It works pretty good. So I have that as a composition. And if I go back here to my other one, I go to texture, and I have this as a composition. Now this is just a composition that's a solid, basically. It's just a still frame. Hide that. So the way I made it is I made a solid, I added a grid to it, and I just adjusted the width and height. So if I wanted more of these, I could go to the height here and increase this or decrease that. I have to really like type it in to even see a change. There we go. So there's that one that would go this way, and then there's this one, which would go the other way. So as I shrink this down, you can see how I'm getting more and more of these. That's too small. What's that on here? 15, I think it was. Yep. So 15 seemed like a good number. So I just added this grid. Now default, it comes in straight like that. So I just rotated it 45. Because I rotated it 45, this solid is actually this big. Okay? Because if I were to have scaled it up, those are pixels. It'll scale the pixels up and make it all fuzzy. I didn't want fuzzy. I wanted nice and crisp. So I made a huge layer, lots of divisions, rotated it, positioned it where I needed it, and that's what it gave me. On top of that, I added another composition, or another layer. That's just a vignette. It's just a solid. It's this brownish color here. I went to my shape tool, and I just drew a shape in the middle. That gives me a mask. And then on the mask, I just went and played with the feathering. So this is what it looks like by default, like that. That's ugly. And then I adjusted the expansion. And then I made sure it was inverted so that the dark spots were on the outs or the inside, and the lighter spot was on there. And then if I just set that to a multiply, put it on top of that layer, I get this. Okay. Now I brought both of those layers together into this composition. And let me just set this to off for a second. So this is my textures composition or texture layer. Let me set this to normal. Okay, so we don't see the other one. I set this to soft light, and now I can at least see how that composition comes in. And now what I needed to do was to clip it so that I wouldn't see the bars until I'm ready for them. So under Effect, under Channel, I went to Set Matte. And so we talked about before how we can pick a layer that would be a transparency for this. So that's what I'm doing. I'm bring this out so I can see the difference. I'm going to set this to all these off, I believe. And source, oops, set this to bands. That's what it should be on. There we go. And now what it's doing is it's using that other layer as where it shows up. Okay. Just like the track mat, except the track mat one has to be in a certain order and they have to hide it and all that stuff. This one, I don't have to do that. This one, I can pick any layer in the stack and just say, this is the transparency, this is where it's coming from. Okay. And if I wanted to use that for something else, if I duplicated this texture and rotated it 90 degrees that way, or 180, that would make more sense. There we go. And set that to multiply, let's see, hard light. Maybe overlay. That looks kind of neat. It's a little hurty on the eyes, but you know, just for the example, I guess. But now that'll still work. Well, actually, it's pretty sweet. Yeah, that's fancy. Look at that. So I like that part of it. That's pretty cool. It has to go off screen. Yep. So every one of these, I want you to picture that we have a video here, and I'll show you the use for it. There. Right. Yeah. No, we wouldn't want to use those for this. Beach video. Here we go. So here's a beach video. Great. I'll grab one more video here. Sahara. Drop these together. Okay. So here's one video, and I just want to transition to the other one without getting this. Okay. This is a cut. We wouldn't want to have a cut in there. So if I were to take any one of these final ones, final, whichever one, and drug that inside here and slid this over, it's a different size, so obviously you have to scale it up. So I'll make this 133 or 125. 150. Yep, there we go. If I make this 150 like this, so here's the desert. See how it covers the entire screen? And then while it's covered, I'm going to cut this video and then cut that video. And then when it's revealed, we should be at the other one. Okay, so we'll look at that transition right here. So ignore the audio too. Okay, so easily we go from one item to the other item without any like, you know, craziness happening here as far as like this. You know, this looks horrible, just, you know, even a fade is kind of boring in motion graphics. In video editing, it's one thing, it works, but in motion graphics, we need to create a cool transition to bring someone from one spot to the next spot. If you ever saw the show Home Improvement, you were probably, you know, 2 years old at the time it was out, if that. They would take one scene and then they would cut pieces from that one scene, make them fall, and then the next scene would come in on top of it. So very similar to, you know, this kind of stuff, but much more simplified. Okay, and I think that was the last one. This one? Yeah, that was the one I showed last time. Okay. Now, just one more example on the Null stuff, just so you can see it. I'm going to make a composition or a solid that's 500 by 500 here. And this is really where, you know, we would use this kind of Null animation stuff. I'm going to put the pivot down here in the corner. And I'm going to scoot him up some. There. Okay. So I'm going to have this kind of roll into the screen. So he's going to start here, scoochy up a bit, go there. Okay, so he does. Now I want him to roll over again. So that's where I would use a null. I'd move him down here. Come on. Yeah, that's all it's doing. Eventually we'll use it for other stuff, but that's what we're using it for here. I have to get this right on. I really do. It won't, now it is. It wasn't a second ago. Apparently it will now, because you asked. So I'm going to parent it here. I'll go to the rotate, set a keyframe there, scooch up a bit, go to 90 here. Okay. Okay. Now if I wanted to do it again, I had another null. And I go right to where that keyframe is, and I'm not going to parent this to the other null. I'm going to parent this null to that one. So it can get confusing because you can have basically like this object or this layer is parented to a null, which is then parented to a null, which is then parented to a null, and so on. But the easier you have this kind of set up, I parented it too soon. I have to not parent it yet. I have to move it first. Ask it again, Sam. It's not Maybe it's just mention your name, then it works. It might, yeah. There. There we go. Okay. Now you try to animate that any other way just by manually doing the one thing, and you're never going to get it. It's going to be incredibly difficult trying to make it feel like it's pivoting off of that point. I know, that's why I was showing it to you.
I stopped doing that. I was like,
see, just null, null, null. And the more you do, the smaller the cube, the more you want to bound or roll, then the more you would do there. And then what's cool about that too, I believe this should work backwards, right? As long as we do this the correct order. So I put a keyframe here, go this way, make this -90, oops, not -90, 0. And then go to this one, and then go a little bit faster because we're running out of frames. So that should work. Yep. Right? And then if I wanted to scale it up or something, I could scale it up from that point or whatever. Okay. Now when we get into character stuff, we'll use nulls all over the place. In order for us to move an arm, the arm might be broken up into the bicep, the forearm, the hand. We'll have a null that will control the entire arm. So we have one spot right there. We might have a null that will control all the finger movements if we were to get that detailed with it. Later classes, not this 1900 class, but later After Effects classes, will get more involved in finger movements, face movements, all of that stuff.